Welcome to Bad to Best, where I show you how to improve your filmmaking one mistake at a time. I've been making movies for years, but for a lot of that time I didn't have any real training, so I made a lot of mistakes. Hopefully, by showing you some of those mistakes in old movies that I've made, you'll be able to avoid making the same ones yourself. Today, we'll be looking at one of my first attempts to make a serious narrative-driven film, created with some friends while I was a junior in high school, and shot almost entirely on location in my neighborhood. It is a historical war drama that's about 42 minutes long and is set during the Spanish Civil War. I present to you No Pasarán, the Battle of Jarama. While inspired by historical events, I took a lot of liberties with the history. I took a lot of liberties with the film in general, honestly. Remember, if you're going to be making a film about actual history, try to keep it as accurate as you can, since a lot of people's ideas about what certain time periods were like is based on the movies they've seen. Obviously, you may not be able to get every detail right, but the closer you can make it, the better. And honestly, it wouldn't take a whole lot to get better than this. It's just kids in jeans, t-shirts, and paper hats. Starting out, I am pretty happy with this opening. The credits with actual newsreel footage from the war playing behind them works pretty well. The biggest lesson here, though, is about the sound. When editing sound, one of the worst things you can do is to let the sound peak. Now, peaking is when the sound gets so loud, the microphone can't pick up all the information. When this happens, the sound gets distorted and starts sounding bad very quickly. Thankfully, this is a pretty easy problem to catch. When you're recording or editing sound, watch the sound levels. They work a lot like a stoplight. Green means you're good, yellow means be careful, and red means you're peaking. Upper green or low yellow is generally where you want to be when recording. You'll get good, loud sound, but you won't lose any of the information to distortion. Red is a no-no. You see red at all, and it means you're peaking and your sound is distorted. When I was making this, I didn't know a thing about sound recording or editing. I wanted the music for the opening credits loud, so I just cranked the volume up. Now, when you listen to it, it sounds very distorted and garbled because it was peaking. Another thing to think about from this sequence is titles. You want your titles to be visible enough for people to read them. Because the background footage is black and white, I opted to use red for the titles in this sequence. However, the red is dark enough that there's still some times where it's difficult to read the words. Choosing a different color, or at least a brighter shade of red, would have helped with this problem. These titles also drag on for quite a while. The newsreel footage helps keep it from dragging too much, but it's still a bit self-indulgent. And here we go, the first scene of the film. This is the setup for the story that's to come, and it's dark. Really, really dark. So dark that the camera even has trouble focusing. Now, I wanted to have the scene feel dark, since it's supposed to be set in a dimly lit bar, but I went about it entirely the wrong way. The best way to show darkness is with contrast. Contrast is the difference between the lights and darks in your image. If there's not much difference between the light and the dark, it's a low contrast image. If there's a lot of difference between the light and the dark, then it's a high contrast image. If you want a scene to feel dark, you need to make the image have high contrast. Basically, keep the lights light, but make sure the dark areas are very dark and shadowy. I did not do that in this scene. Instead, I just turned off the lights in the room. This made the entire image way too dark, so instead of feeling dimly lit and moody, it's just hard to see what's going on. The only thing that makes the scene visible at all is a few lights in the back of the room that we couldn't turn off. One of the first things to know about cameras is exposure. Cameras capture images by light coming in through the front where the camera lens is. The human eye is a lot better at picking up images in low light than a camera is, though. Because of this, you may be somewhere that seems plenty bright to you, but to your camera, it isn't nearly light enough. Exposure is a little complicated, but it basically comes down to three main parts: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. On a digital camera, you can generally adjust all three of these. Shutter speed will change how quickly the camera's shutter opens and closes for each frame of the video. The longer the shutter, the more light that can get in, and the brighter the image will be. The shorter the shutter, the less light that can get in, and the darker the image will be. Longer shutter speeds also make movement seem more fluid, while shorter shutter speeds make it look choppier. Aperture is how big the opening on the camera lens is. The bigger the opening, the more light that can get in and the brighter the image will be. The smaller the opening, the less light that can get in and the darker the image will be. Now, aperture is measured in f-stops, which is basically just a series of numbers that show how large or small the opening on the aperture is. It can be a little confusing because the bigger the opening, the smaller the f-stop, and vice versa. So f2 would be a larger opening and thus a lot more light than f11. The final thing to take into account with aperture is depth of field, or how much of the image is in focus. On smaller f-stops, where there's more light coming in, there will be less in focus than on larger f-stops. Basically, if you want to have a specific thing in focus, and everything behind and in front of it blurry, you want a lower f-stop. If you want more of the image in focus, you want a higher f-stop. There's not really any hard and fast rule for this, so a lot of it comes down to just trying things out and seeing what works best for the shot you're trying to do. The final setting that plays into exposure is ISO. This is how sensitive the camera is to light. ISO is very simple. The lower the ISO, the lower the sensitivity to light, and the higher the ISO, the higher the sensitivity to light. Low ISO is darker, high ISO is lighter. Before you just crank up the ISO on your camera as high as it will go, though, you need to know that the higher the ISO, the noisier the image will be. Now, when I say noise, I'm not talking about the noise that you hear. Instead, I'm talking about visual noise. On a digital camera, noise is this nasty-looking stuff that looks a bit like film grain. While grainy film can look okay, it has an old aesthetic that I even played into in this movie. Digital noise almost always looks bad. The higher the noise in an image, the worse the image will look. So exposure is juggling these three settings on the camera: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Get these settings where you want them so that the scene is correctly exposed. Using extra lights can really help with this. The problem in this scene is that there just wasn't enough light to get the right exposure. Shutter speed and aperture were adjusted to the brightest they'd go, yet the scene was still way too dark. Thus, the ISO had to go up to make the scene visible. That created a lot of noise, and still didn't entirely make the image bright enough. So remember, when you're recording audio, make sure not to let the levels peak. When you're making titles, make sure that the viewer can actually read what the title says. And when you are trying to make a scene look dark, use high contrast. Don't just turn the lights off. Do that, and you'll go from bad to best in no time.